Running a criminal empire isn't about fear. It's about staying conscious long enough to wield it. Everyone assumed Rafferty ruled the Vancouver waterfront through violence. They were half right. The violence was the tool. The ledger was the throne. And for 4 months, 3 weeks and 6 days, Rafferty hadn't been able to read either one without the numbers blurring into grey static. Sleep deprivation didn't announce itself the way a bullet did. It crept. It ate through the edges of everything. The sharp peripheral vision that had kept him alive for 20 years, the cold arithmetic of risk that let him outmaneuver every rival who'd ever tried to take what he'd built. He was still dangerous, but he was the kind of dangerous that had started making mistakes. The kind of dangerous that was beginning to scare his own men. Hazel noticed the coffee first. She'd been on the Rafferty account for 11 days, brought in by the legitimate holding company, Harrow Capital, to audit 3 years of financial filings after their internal accountant had a sudden resignation. The terms of her contract were specific. 30 days, no questions outside the numbers, direct access to all records. She'd shown up at the estate on Belmont Avenue with her laptop bag and her calculator, and the particular kind of composure that came from growing up too poor to afford panic. The coffee was the tell. By 9 in the morning on day 1, there were 4 empty cups lined along the edge of the mahogany desk. By 9 on day 5, someone had started leaving a full French press beside her workstation before she arrived. She didn't touch it. She drank the gas station coffee she brought herself, the kind in the paper cup with the plastic tab, the kind that cost $2 and did what it was supposed to do. She was cross-referencing the 2022 import invoices against the doc manifests when she first heard him. It was 11:47 p.m. She'd stayed late because the discrepancy in column J wasn't making sense, and she didn't leave things that didn't make sense. The estate was quiet. The security staff moved through the hallways with practiced silence. Nobody had told her to leave, so she'd simply stayed, working under the single desk lamp she'd dragged to the far corner of the east office. The door opened. She didn't look up. The footsteps were different from the guards, heavier, deliberate, but carrying an edge of exhaustion that changed the rhythm. "Office closes at 8, said a voice. Hazel looked up then. She'd been briefed, technically. She'd seen the photograph in the background check her firm quietly ran on every client, the kind that didn't end up in any official file. She knew what Rafferty looked like on paper. In person, standing in the doorway of his own office at midnight in a charcoal shirt with the collar open and the shadows of 4 months of inadequate sleep carved under his eyes, he looked like something that had survived a war and wasn't entirely sure why. "I have a discrepancy in the maritime invoices," Hazel said. $11,000. I'll find it." Rafferty looked at her. He looked at the stacked binders on the desk, the annotated printouts, the 3 different colored highlighters lined up in a precise row. He looked at her gas station coffee. He didn't tell her to leave. He walked to the leather chair in the corner, not the executive chair behind the desk, the old one near the window, the one that faced the room, and he sat down. He leaned back. He rested his head against the leather. "Don't let me stop you," he said. Hazel turned back to her spreadsheets. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, quietly, with the occasional murmured calculation when the numbers needed to be heard out loud to make sense. The scratch of her pencil, the soft tap of her fingers on the keyboard, the faint sound of pages turning. At 3:18 a.m. she found it, a duplicate entry in the container fees, traced back to a vendor who'd been billing twice and pocketing the difference. Clean, small, the kind of theft designed to stay invisible for years. She circled it in red. She wrote the vendor name and account numbers on a separate page and stapled it to the top of the file. Then she looked up to tell Rafferty. He was asleep. Not the shallow, twitching sleep of a man who kept one eye open. He was genuinely, deeply asleep, his head tipped slightly to one side, his hands loose in his lap. The tension that had been pulling at the corners of his mouth was gone. He looked, for a disorienting moment, like an ordinary man who was simply very tired. Hazel sat with that for a moment. Then she put her files in order, capped her highlighters, and quietly packed her bag. She left the circled discrepancy on top of the stack where he'd see it. She turned off the desk lamp, leaving only the ambient light from the city bleeding through the tall windows. She let herself out without waking him. He called her firm the next morning and extended her contract to 90 days. She found out later that he'd slept for 6 hours. It was the longest stretch since November. The rhythm established itself without either of them naming it. Rafferty didn't explain. He was not, Hazel gathered quickly, a man who explained himself. He simply appeared in the East office most nights after 10, took the leather chair by the window, and let her work. Sometimes he was on his phone in the early hours, low voice, terse instructions, the kind of conversation she deliberately didn't listen to. But gradually, as the weeks moved forward, he'd put the phone down earlier. By the 3rd week, he'd stopped bringing it at all. She brought an extra gas station coffee on the 14th night. She set it on the side table next to the leather chair without comment and went back to her work. He drank it. He didn't say thank you. She didn't expect him to. She learned things from the ledgers that she wasn't supposed to learn. She learned that Harrow Capital's consulting fees were extraordinarily generous to a very small number of companies that never seemed to produce any traceable work. She learned that the doc manifests had a pattern of small irregularities, too consistent to be errors, too subtle to trip an ordinary audit. She learned that someone inside the legitimate holding company had been feeding information to a third party, the same third party whose name kept appearing, obliquely, in flagged transactions going back 18 months. She wrote all of it down. She kept it in a separate file, locked in her own bag. She was not naive about what it meant. She was just practical about what to do with it. Rafferty noticed. "You've been running a parallel audit," he said one night. Not a question. He was watching her from the leather chair with the particular quality of attention she'd come to recognize, not threatening exactly, calculating. The way she looked at a column of figures that didn't yet balance. Hazel set her pencil down. She pulled the secondary file from her bag and placed it on the desk. "Someone inside Harrow Capital has been selling your position to a competitor," she said. 18 months. The method is courier-coded vendor invoices. I can trace 8 transactions. There are probably more. Rafferty looked at the file. He did not touch it. "Most people who found that," he said, "would have gone directly to my competitor." "Most people don't finish what they start," Hazel said. She picked up her pencil again. He picked up the file. She heard him reading. The pages turned slowly. He was going through it carefully. She kept her eyes on the Q3 reconciliation. She had flagged the transactions in sequence, so the logic would be clear to someone working backwards from the conclusion. She'd written it the way she wrote everything, nothing speculative, only what the numbers could prove. 18 months, he said quietly. At least. He said a name, said it the way people said names when they'd been waiting to say them out loud. Hazel said nothing. She'd traced the invoices to a senior manager in the Capital Division, but had left the name unwritten. She'd left that conclusion for Rafferty to draw himself. Some things should be earned. He set the file back on the desk. He looked at her for a long moment. "You could have used this," he said. "I'm being paid to find discrepancies," Hazel said. "That's a discrepancy." He almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but it was there at the corner of his mouth, present for a fraction of a second before he looked away, and she filed it the same way she filed everything. Noted, categorized, kept. The shift came in the 5th week, from a direction she hadn't budgeted for. She was buying groceries at the market on Granville. The one her mother had always liked before the arthritis made the walk too far, when a man in a grey jacket came up beside her at the produce section. She was reaching for the Granny Smiths that were on sale. He didn't reach for anything. He just stood close enough that she could hear him without anyone else in the aisle being able to. "Careful who you keep company with, love," he said. "The dead don't need accountants." Then he moved past her, and was gone through the back of the store. Hazel stood in the produce aisle for a moment with an apple in her hand. She set it back in the bin. She finished her shopping. She paid. She walked out to where the black SUV that had started appearing in week 3 was idling at the curb. 2 quiet men who never came inside but were always there when she came out, and she got in the back seat and held her grocery bag in her lap and watched the city move past the tinted windows. She was good at arithmetic. The man in the grey jacket translated easily. Someone outside the estate knew who she was and what she did inside it. She had stopped being invisible. Invisibility had been the only thing standing between her and the part of this arrangement that could go badly. She told Rafferty that evening. She told it the way she told him about the vendor invoices, in sequence, factually, without the fear that wouldn't have helped anything. He went very still. It was different from his usual stillness. This wasn't the considered quiet of a man who processed before reacting. This was the stillness of someone holding themselves back from something that would happen very fast. Height, build, what he was wearing, Rafferty said. She described him. He was quiet for a moment, staring at the far wall. She recognized the expression. He was running a calculation she wasn't privy to, working columns she couldn't see. Stannard, he said, to no one in particular. He stood. He picked up his phone, then he paused and looked at her. You should have called me from the market. I needed to decide if it was relevant first, Hazel said. He stared at her. And I was almost out of apples. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a clean category for. He turned away and made the call. She found out about the senior manager 3 days later, not from Rafferty, but from the absence of the name on the building's sign-in sheet. One morning he wasn't there, and by afternoon someone else was sitting at his desk, quiet and careful and not asking questions. She finished the parallel audit. She gave Rafferty the complete file. All 8 trace transactions and 5 more flagged as probable, clearly marked with her confidence levels and the supporting documentation. He read it in the leather chair while she worked on the legitimate Q3 filings, which were, by comparison, the most straightforward thing she'd touched in 2 months. When he finished, he set the file on the arm of the chair. You're thorough, he said. That's what you're paying for. You're paid for the public accounts, Rafferty said, not for what was inside that file. Hazel kept her eyes on the spreadsheet. Consider it a rounding error. The silence stretched longer than usual. What do you owe? He said. She looked up. Your mother's care facility, Rafferty said. St. Catherine's. The account is 3 months behind. Her stomach went cold. Not from fear, exactly. From the particular discomfort of understanding that she had been read the same way she'd read the ledgers. Column by column, without sentiment. That's not your business, she said. I'm making it my business. He produced a small card and set it on the desk between them. Call that number. Tell them it's been handled. Hazel looked at the card. She didn't touch it. I don't take money for things outside the contract. It isn't for the audit, Rafferty said. He leaned forward slightly. In the lamplight, the exhaustion in his face was different from how it had been 6 weeks ago. Less corrosive. The edges of it had softened. He was sleeping, not without difficulty, not without the particular quiet she created in this room, but he was sleeping. Something was being rebuilt in him, slowly, the way structural repairs happened, not visible until they were done. Consider it a retainer. For what? For staying. The word landed differently than she expected, stripped of the commanding tone he usually carried. It was a plain word. The request underneath it was plainer still, and she understood, with the same clarity she brought to an unbalanced column, that it had cost him something to say it out loud. Hazel looked at him across the desk. She picked up the card. I'll need access to the Q4 marine files, she said. Paxton will get you the key in the morning. She put the card in her bag. She pulled the Q3 file back in front of her and clicked her pen. Rafferty settled back into the leather chair. She worked. The city beyond the windows went dark and quiet. Sometime around 2 in the morning, she heard his breathing deepen and slow, the way it always did, the shift she'd stopped pretending not to notice weeks ago. She worked for another hour after that. She finished the quarterly reconciliation. She flagged 2 minor errors for follow-up. Nothing dramatic, the kind of thing that happened when people moved numbers too fast and didn't go back to check. She wrote her notes in the margin in her small, precise handwriting. Then she sat back and looked at the man asleep in the leather chair. She was not, she reminded herself, sentimental. She was practical, which her mother had always said were the same thing wearing different clothes. She had come to this office for a contract and a paycheck, and the work had been complicated, but the work always was. The calculation she was running now was this. She was no longer invisible, and she wasn't leaving. And those 2 facts together meant something she hadn't entirely planned for when she'd walked in here with her laptop bag and her gas station coffee and her talent for finding the one number in 10,000 that didn't belong. She picked up her notebook. She wrote at the top of a clean page, assets, liabilities, balance. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook. Some ledgers didn't need to be formalized. Some things settled into equilibrium without being written down. The steady scratch of a pencil in a quiet room, 2 coffees on a side table, 6 hours of sleep where there had been none for months. A man who had spent 20 years calculating every human being in his life as either a resource or a threat, encountering the one thing his empire couldn't provide him, and a woman too stubborn to leave a discrepancy unresolved. Hazel turned off the desk lamp. In the half-dark, the city lights came through the tall windows and lay across the floor in long, even lines. She sat with it for a moment. Then she reached into her bag, took out the next file, and pulled the lamp back on, because Q4 wasn't going to audit itself, and she had never once in her life left a job half-finished. The pencil moved. The numbers added up. Across the room, Rafferty slept.